there's a lot of talk out there right now about the truck driver shortage and everything. So I don't know. They're trying to figure out why. They're coming up with all these different reasons why nobody wants to drive a truck and why. There's truth to the reasons that they're bringing up, but it's not the whole story. It's like a piece of the story. The piece, it's got multiple pieces. I mean, there's a lot of guys out there that just say it's all the companies. It's all the companies. There are some horrible companies out there. I tried leasing a truck from a company, and all they wanted was free labor. It wound up being the worst experience of my life. But I've been really lucky. Other than that company, most of the companies I've worked for, they've been really good companies. So it's not always the company. It's, people got to remember that the company has to deal with the same stress and regulations that we as a driver have to deal with. So, on that level, it's not always the company. I mean, sometimes the company is just put in the same position that we as a driver are. And I mean, it's just, I think that's the biggest problem. It's not, when you bring people into the industry and they realize, I mean, I tell people all the time, you want to turn a progressive into a conservative, take them out and make them a truck driver. I mean, this industry shows, I mean, if you want to understand about big government being out of control, this is what you get into. You drive a truck and you really understand big government being out of control. And it's not about, I'm not complaining about rules and regulations, because obviously we need rules and regulations. I mean, these are big vehicles, these are dangerous vehicles. You can't have people out there hell raising and wildling and all this and all that. But that's not what guys are complaining about. I mean, anybody like to read? I can go out and find #1 bestseller books on the Times #1 list, written by #1 authors. I mean, authors that have repeatedly written #1 books. And I mean, I'm talking even Stephen King books. There's some Stephen King books out there that I know they're really, but there's some paperbacks out there that, they're reasonable sized books. Or books by Mark Levin, or books by Sean Hannity, or books by Clive Barker. I mean, there's books out there that are #1 books, and they're smaller than our rules and regulations. This thing is a Bible. This is our rules and regulation. This thing weighs over a pound. I mean, and this is what this is what the truck driver has to deal with day in and day out. This book. This is the Bible that the truck driver has to live by. This thing is not a small book. And when somebody comes into the industry, I mean, at first when they go through, they realize that there's a lot to learn. But when you're learning just the book side of it, when you're going through the training and everything, it doesn't seem like it's all that much, because there's a lot of stuff that you're still not told. Even when they hand you that book, you don't realize it. I mean, it just seems like, oh, okay, but then you start looking and you don't think it all applies to you, but it actually all applies to you. And then the logs. It's not, like, for example, the 14-hour rule. You can argue that it should be, you could actually argue reasonably that it could be 16 hours, because most interstate, I'm over the road, but most intrastate drivers are allowed to work 16 hours a day. So that 2-hour difference right there is your proof that 2-hour difference isn't a big safety hazard, because otherwise all your local drivers would be wrecking left and right. I mean, if that 2-hour difference was, so there's some argument that you can increase it to a 16-hour day, and then the 11-hour driving day, 11 hours of drive time seems pretty reasonable. I mean, if you wanted to take it up an hour or two, I mean, there's argument for that too because of that 2 hour. That's already been proven that it's not a major risk. But the thing that stresses the driver out the worst is it's not really your local drivers, it's your over-the-road drivers. They have this ridiculous rule that we're only allowed to work 70 hours a week. Now, I know you're thinking, 70 hours a week, that's a lot of week. Yeah, but think about how many people out there have 2 or 3 jobs. They're working a hell of a lot more than 70 hours a week. Think about managers. I'm an experienced retail manager. As an experienced retail manager, I can tell you that a 100-hour week is not uncommon. That's actually the norm for an experienced retail manager, especially someone working in a 24-hour chain. I used to work in 24-hour chain. I mean, a 100-hour week, 110-hour week, that was a normal week for me. So, you can't say that, that the 70-hour week is all that unheard of, because it's not. It's actually not that uncommon for for anybody working. Even a lawyer and doctors work a 100-hour week. Lawyers work well beyond 80 hours a week. I mean, yeah, granted, they're not doing it all in the office, but they do a lot of work at home. They do a lot of work in meetings. I mean, your average lawyer is working well over 80 hours a week. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that realistically, even with just one job, they're still working over 80 hours a week. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to do that and then drive home or to and from work. I mean, they drive on top of all that. So the 70-hour rule, it's especially for an over-the-road driver, it's just arcane, because when I'm out here on the road, I'm not out here to sit at a rest area for 34 hours to do a reset. I mean, I'm out here on the road, away from family and away from things I want to work on my car, or want to work on my cabin that I want to build, or work on the property. There are things I want to do. I don't want to be sitting out here. If I'm just stuck sitting, that's stressing me out. I'm not relaxing. I'm not resting when I'm stuck sitting somewhere for 34 hours. I'm stressing out. And when I was married, it was even worse. The stress level was even higher because my wife is mad that I'm sitting somewhere on the side of the road instead of being able to sit at home. I mean, when I'm out here on the road, I want to be working. I want to be making money. When I'm sitting still, I am not resting. That's when my stress levels are probably the highest, is when I'm being forced to sit still. So that 70-hour rule, all it does is make my job, that's the biggest, most stressful part of this job, is being forced to sit somewhere. And then, because say I go out for 4 weeks, so I want to be home for 5 days, but then somewhere in that 4 weeks I did 2 resets, which means now instead of being home for 5 days, I'm only home for 3 days, because I have to make up them 2 days that I lost while I was out on the road. I mean, I have to make them up. I need that money because I didn't make that money while I was out there. So, that whole 70-hour rule, it's just archaic. It makes absolutely no sense. There's no reason why, if I want to work for a few weeks, and then we have to deal with this recap. That's another part of the rule, that if you work that 70-hour week, then you got to try and figure, and it's not a week, it's 8 days. It's not like it's 70 hours in 7 days. It's 70 hours in 8 days, which means in reality, you can only work 8.5 hours a day. Think about that. You can only work 8.5 hours a day. I have to spend 15 minutes a day doing my pre-trip, 15 minutes a day doing my post-trip, and 15 minutes almost every day fueling up my truck. That means in reality, I can only drive 7 hours and 45 minutes every day if I want to have hours every single day where I'm not going to be sitting for 34 hours. I mean, that's ridiculous. It makes no sense, especially for an over-the-road. And this is why when you do bring people into this industry, you can't keep them, because they look at that and they're like, well, that makes no, I'm not sitting out here for free. And you can't blame the company. I mean, you can't expect the company to pay somebody for not working, but you can't expect somebody to sit out away from home and not feel like they're not working either. I mean, so there's things with just the hours of service rules that they could just fix. It's just that 70-hour rule. You take that 70-hour rule away, and that just takes so much stress off the driver. I mean, that there in itself that in itself, do you know how many people that come into this industry, the industry could retain if we just got rid of the stupid 70-hour rule? 70-hour rule by itself. And if you want to make it where your local drivers still have to be by that 70-hour rule, this way they're not being abused or something, then okay, then maybe there's some sense in that. But for us over-the-road guys, that 70-hour rule makes absolutely no sense at all. It's actually our biggest stressor. I mean, all the stress we got to deal with traffic, that 70-hour, it's the biggest stressor we have to deal with. And it makes absolutely no sense. There's no logic behind it. I mean, this isn't a union industry. I mean, yeah, there's a union out there, but overall, most of us aren't in a union. And even still, the only way that 70-hour rule works for us is if we're home every week. And then that kind of kills it, because for me, for example, I stay out for 4 or 5 weeks at a time, which means I get 1 day off, and then I get 1 day off for each week I'm out. So if I stay out 5 weeks, I go home 6 days. I'd rather be home for 6 straight days than be home for a day and a half every week. Because to me, going home, staying out for a month and a week, I get a week vacation. And to me, that's just so much better, because the job itself, I'm making more money by being out for weeks at a time, because I can run longer stretches of distance. I can run longer, and I can actually make more money. If I'm home every weekend, the only way for me to be home every weekend or to be home every week, I can't run 2 big, long 2,500 mile trips or 2,000 mile trips. There's no way for it to mathematically work. It will not work. It just, I could be home every other week doing that, but then if I'm home every other week, I'm only home 2 days. And when you're out here for 2 weeks and you go home for 2 days, your first day, you just spend your first day resting. You spend your first day doing absolutely nothing. Your second day, you get to run around and do everything, and then your third day, you got to get back out on the road, so you got to go to sleep early that night. So you don't really ever feel like you had a day. You don't feel like you ever had any time off anyway. So for us over the road guys, that makes absolutely no sense. We spend too much time on the road to only be home for 2 days. It doesn't make sense. It's just not. I mean, if you're running the Southeast, or if you're running a region, then it makes more sense, because then you can be home every weekend, which means you're usually leaving early Monday morning and you're getting home late Friday. So you're going to bed Friday night, you're waking up Saturday morning, and you're spending all day Saturday, and then Saturday night you go out with the guys. Sunday you rest, you recover, you do what you want to do around the yard, and then you go back out Monday. You go to bed pretty early Sunday, and then you're back out there Monday. So if you're running a regional, it makes sense then to be home to do that, to be home for 2 days. But for us as over-road guys, it makes no sense at all. And that's why the 70-hour rule, it just doesn't make sense. It's just, that's one of the biggest, I think that's one of the big things that's keeping guys out of the industry. I mean, they keep saying, well, and you have all these, everybody's worrying, they're saying, well, how can reduce the stress on me, for one? By getting rid of that 70-hour rule, just the stress that's released on me, that I don't have to worry about that week in and week out, that in itself is just the biggest, that would be the biggest improvement right now that DC can make on the locks. Just get rid of the 70-hour rule. And you're going to see guys that have been on blood pressure pills for the last 2 or 3 years, all of a sudden, they ain't going to need blood pressure pills within the next couple months. They're not going to need it anymore, because that's probably our biggest stressor. I mean, there's other things out here that are stressing us out, but when you got to constantly keep that in your head, that 70-hour rule, and you're trying to figure out how to keep your running consistently, so you can keep making your paycheck consistently, so you can be out there for a few weeks at a time and then actually have some reasonable time off at home. That's the biggest number one fix right there. And then that will also help retain more people. that right there in itself, probably half the drivers that you lose, that you bring into the industry and lose to the industry within that first 6 months or so, that right there, you'll retain half of those drivers, probably just like that. They'll stay. Because now it's worth their while to be out there for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And then they know, well, if I'm out here for 3 or 4 weeks and then I'm going to be home for 4 to 5 days, yeah, that's pretty nice. And then, then it makes sense and that solves a lot of our problems. So that's number one. That's number one fix.